Every year, over 1,300 of the world's leading experts, economists, scientists, government officials, security analysts, and business leaders are asked a single question: what is the most dangerous threat facing the planet right now? And every year, the answers are tracked, ranked, and published in what is arguably the most closely watched risk document on Earth, the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report. In January 2026, that report came out, and the number one threat, the risk that the highest percentage of experts identified as most likely to trigger a material global crisis, was not a virus. It was not a nuclear weapon. It was not even climate change. It was something that most ordinary people have never heard described as a threat at all. It is called geoeconomic confrontation. And by the time this script is done, you are going to understand exactly why it is already hitting you, and why it is going to hit a lot harder before it gets better. Let us start with what geoeconomic confrontation actually means, because the term sounds technical and distant in a way that completely obscures how immediate and personal its effects already are. Geoeconomic confrontation is what happens when countries stop competing primarily through military force and start competing primarily through economic weapons. Tariffs, sanctions, export controls, investment bans, technology restrictions, supply chain sabotage. These are the tools of the new global conflict, and they are being deployed at a scale and speed that the global economy was never designed to absorb. The WEF report defines it precisely as the use of economic tools and policies to advance geopolitical objectives and gain power. And in 2026, this is not a description of something that might happen. It is a description of something that is actively happening right now, affecting the prices of things you buy, the availability of products you depend on, and the stability of the jobs held by hundreds of millions of people around the world. Think about what happened with tariffs in 2025. The United States escalated its trade policies against multiple major trading partners, triggering rounds of retaliatory measures that reshaped global supply chains almost overnight. Manufacturing costs jumped. Companies that had built global production models over decades were forced to restructure in months. Smaller businesses, with no reserves to cushion the shock, faced the most acute pressure. A recent academic analysis cited in WEF research found that tariff increases alone could result in cumulative global job declines exceeding 23 million. Not eventually. Over the near term, as economic realignment ripples through interconnected production networks that span every continent. That number, 23 million jobs, is not an abstract projection. It is a forecast about real people losing real income in economies that are already under pressure from high costs of living, elevated debt levels, and sluggish growth. And here is what makes this particular threat so difficult to recognize and respond to. Unlike a hurricane or a pandemic, it does not arrive in a single dramatic moment. Geoeconomic confrontation works slowly, then suddenly. It accumulates quietly in the form of slightly higher prices, slightly longer delivery times, slightly reduced product availability, slightly higher borrowing costs, until one day a factory closes, a supply chain breaks, or a currency crashes, and millions of people who were not watching the geopolitical news suddenly find themselves directly in the damage zone. The WEF report puts it starkly. The world is balancing on a precipice. The turmoil caused by kinetic wars alongside the deployment of economic weapons for strategic advantage is continuing to fragment societies. Rules and institutions that have long underpinned global stability are under siege in a new era in which trade, finance, and technology are wielded as weapons of influence. Consider the specific mechanisms through which this threat reaches ordinary people, because understanding the pathway is critical to understanding the urgency. The first and most visible mechanism is prices. When major economies impose tariffs on goods from other countries, those costs do not stay at the border. They pass through the entire supply chain and land, ultimately on the price tags of products in stores. Inflation driven by trade policy is different from inflation driven by supply and demand, because it cannot be resolved by simply waiting for markets to adjust. It is structural. It persists as long as the tariffs persist. And tariffs, once imposed, tend to stay, because removing them requires a political decision that is always harder than imposing them in the first place. In 2025, global tariffs rose sharply, driven largely by U.S. trade measures, with manufacturing most affected. The compounding effect of multiple rounds of retaliatory tariffs, where country A responds to country B's tariffs with tariffs of its own, creates what economists call a trade war spiral. UNCTAD, the UN's trade and development body, has warned that frequent policy shifts increase uncertainty, discourage investment, and disrupt supply chains, with smaller and less diversified economies being most exposed to rising costs and trade volatility. The second mechanism is supply chains, and this one is less visible, but potentially more destabilizing than price inflation. The modern global economy runs on supply chains that were built for maximum efficiency, not maximum resilience. Components manufactured in one country are assembled in another, using software designed in a third, running on chips fabbed in a fourth. That system worked brilliantly when geopolitics was relatively stable. When it breaks down, critical components. When investment bans prevent technology transfer. When sanctions exclude entire economies from global financial systems. Entire industries can find themselves unable to produce goods they have been making for decades. The semiconductor situation is the sharpest illustration of this. The U.S. has imposed increasingly strict export controls on advanced chips and chip-making equipment, sold to China. China has responded by accelerating its domestic semiconductor program and restricting exports of rare earth minerals and other critical inputs that the rest of the world depends on. The WTO's dispute settlement system, which was designed to peacefully resolve these kinds of conflicts, is becoming marginalized. The number of cases brought to the WTO dispute system has fallen to approximately one-third of the level before its key arbitration mechanism was disabled in 2019. When the global referee stops working, the referees become the strongest players, and the rules get made by whoever has the most leverage. The third mechanism is energy, and this is where geo-economic confrontation intersects with the physical lives of billions of people in the most direct way. Energy supplies, oil, natural gas, liquefied natural gas, flow through a small number of strategic choke points. The Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, key pipeline routes through Central Asia and Eastern Europe. When geopolitical tensions threaten these choke points, energy prices spike. And when energy prices spike, they drive up the cost of virtually everything else, because energy is embedded in the production of almost every good and service on Earth. The WTO has explicitly warned that sustained increases in energy prices from geopolitical conflict carry potential spillovers for food security and cost pressures on consumers and businesses worldwide. Beyond fuels, disruptions to fertilizer supplies, around on a third of the world's fertilizer exports pass through geopolitically contested waterways, directly threaten agricultural output for billions of people who depend on global food markets to eat. The fourth and perhaps least understood mechanism is the weaponization of technology access itself. In 2026, the most strategically valuable assets in the world are not land, not oil reserves, not nuclear weapons. They are semiconductor fabrication processes, artificial intelligence training infrastructure, advanced satellite systems, and the communications networks that knit the global digital economy together. Nations are increasingly treating access to these assets as a national security issue, and restricting, blocking, or weaponizing that access as a tool of geopolitical leverage. The WEF report describes this as part of a broader divergence between West, East, and South, with countries that used to share a common economic framework now operating in parallel, partially decoupled technological ecosystems. For businesses and workers operating in this environment, the implications are profound. Products that relied on a globally integrated technology, supply chains suddenly require complete redesign. Investment that assumed long-term access to particular markets or inputs gets stranded when political relationships shift. Innovation that depended on the free flow of scientific knowledge across borders gets slowed or blocked by new security classifications. Now here's the part that makes all of this harder to solve and more dangerous for more people than it might otherwise be. The institutions that were designed to manage and contain exactly this kind of conflict are failing. The WTO dispute system is being bypassed. The multilateral frameworks built after World War II, the ones that created 70 years of unprecedented global economic growth and relative peace, are being challenged from multiple directions simultaneously. 68% of WEF survey respondents now expect the global political environment to be characterized by a fragmented multipolar order over the next decade, not a cooperative world, not a rules-based world, a contested world where middle and great powers compete to set and enforce regional rules and norms. And in a fragmented multipolar world, the shock absorbers that cushioned ordinary people from geopolitical turbulence no longer work the way they used to. Trade agreements that smoothed price volatility are being torn up. Financial systems that allowed capital to flow to where it was most productive are being bifurcated along geopolitical lines. International institutions that could mediate disputes and coordinate responses are losing authority and funding. The result is a world that is more exposed to economic shocks, less equipped to respond to them cooperatively, and more likely to allow those shocks to cascade into something much worse. The World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report 2026 is explicit about who pays the highest price in this environment. It is not the wealthy. Wealthy individuals, wealthy companies, and wealthy countries have the resources, the flexibility, and the political connections to adapt. They absorb supply chain shocks through diversification. They hedge currency risk through financial instruments. They relocate operations to stay ahead of tariff regimes. Ordinary people cannot do any of those things. Pensioners who have to choose between heating and medicine cannot hedge their energy costs. Students who need to rethink studying abroad cannot diversify their options with a phone call to a logistics consultant. Workers in industries caught in the crossfire of trade wars cannot simply relocate to a different sector overnight. Parents stretching grocery budgets to feed their families cannot wait out inflation until geopolitics stabilizes. The WEF report describes a world of K-shaped economies, where the upper portion of the income distribution separates further and further from the lower portion, with geo-economic confrontation acting as one of the key drivers of that separation. Inequality was identified as the most interconnected risk in the entire global risks landscape for a second consecutive year, because it connects to and amplifies almost every other risk on the list. When people feel economically squeezed, politically abandoned, and culturally threatened, the politics that emerge tend to be divisive and volatile, which feeds societal polarization, which feeds the kind of extreme governance that makes geoeconomic confrontation worse, which squeezes people harder. It is a feedback loop, and it is already running. The good news, and there is good news, is that none of this is predetermined. The WEF report is explicit on this point too. None of these risks are a foregone conclusion. Effective governance, cooperation between countries and sectors, and timely action can still reduce the severity of these risks. The warning systems are working. The data is available. The consequences of inaction are increasingly visible and measurable. But the gap between what the data says and what political systems are actually doing is the widest it has been in decades. And that gap is where the damage happens, not in the abstract projections of risk reports, but in the real and daily lives of hundreds of millions of people who are already feeling the pressure and who will feel significantly more of it before the trajectory changes. You are probably one of them, which is why this story matters and why it matters right now, because the most dangerous threats in human history are never the ones that announce themselves loudly. They are the ones that build quietly in the background, while most people assume that someone else is managing the situation. The Cold War. Nuclear risk was managed, but not because people ignored it. It was managed precisely because enough people understood it, demanded responses, and held leaders accountable for navigating it carefully. Geoeconomic confrontation is the defining risk of this decade. It is already embedded in your grocery bill, your energy costs, your job market, and the availability of the products you depend on. It is reshaping the political landscape in ways that compound every other problem on the list, from climate action to pandemic preparedness to technological governance. The experts who identified it as the top global risk for 2026 are not alarmists. They are the people closest to the data, closest to the decision-making, and closest to the consequences. When 1 in 3 of them says this is the risk most likely to trigger a material global crisis, that is not a warning to file away. That is a warning to act on. The question is not whether this threat will impact a lot of people. It already is. The question is whether enough people understand it clearly enough to demand the kind of governance, the kind of international cooperation, and the kind of systemic resilience that can actually change the trajectory before the feedback loops become impossible to reverse. History's most consequential turning points were rarely recognized as turning points in the moment they happened. They were recognized only in retrospect by people looking back and wondering why no one acted sooner, why the warnings were not louder, why the public was not paying more attention. We are at one of those turning points right now. The tools of war have changed, the battlefield has changed, but the consequences for jobs, for families, for communities, for the basic stability of daily life are just as real as any conflict that came before. The experts have done their job. They have identified the threat, ranked it, and published it for the world to see. The rest is up to all of us. That answer depends on people like you knowing this threat exists and taking it seriously.